Ever since we first got our hands on Elden Ring over 2 years ago, I think it's fair to say the level of hate Marika's gotten has been on the almost same level as Joffrey from Game of Thrones. People having gone as far as to call Marika the true villain of Elden Ring. But the DLC has shed some more light on that. In fact, Miyazaki has basically got that idea, slapped it on the butt and sent it off on its way. Marika, as we now know from the DLC, is not evil. Surprisingly, there's actually a lot of reasoning behind the actions Marika takes, and looking back on it, it makes a lot of sense, and I'm surprised we didn't see this before. Or at least that we didn't consider the fact that maybe there might actually be some logical reasoning behind her actions, apart from just wanting to prop up the Erdtree. If you do end up enjoying the video, please consider leaving a like and subscribe, as it greatly helps the channel, and it helps me know that you're enjoying this style of content. Without any further ado, please sit back, relax, grab some juicy, succulent and tasty prawns if you want, and enjoy it as we delve into Marika the Eternal. Marika the Eternal, as we know from the base game, is a Numen, and as we find out inside the DLC, the Numen are actually called the Shaman, or at least another name for them is the Shaman. If you've looked into Marika's lore or the Numen's lore at all, you'll know they are stated to be denizens of another world. Now, it might be easy to assume that this other world is just the Land of Shadows, but I actually don't think this is the case. We know the Land of Shadows and its inhabitants are very heavily linked to the Crucible. All of them have sort of horns and different ailments that is directly associated with the Crucible, and yet the Numen don't have any of that. Their bodies are clear of any protrusions or horns. They are an outlier when it comes to the inhabitants of the Land of Shadows. So that further reinforces the fact that maybe they truly do come from a different world. This is further reinforced by the fact that promotional stuff talks about Marika and how the Land of Shadow is where she first stepped foot. The question now though is, if they are not from the Land of Shadows, where exactly are they from and how did they get there? Someone in the last video mentioned that the Shaman actually came on boats and ships, and I was a bit confused by this, but then I had this eureka moment. On the Cerulean coast, there are tons of ships crashed into the sides of the coasts. They have these ghost gloveworts which are for fallen heroes. Something I found very interesting though was the fact that there were these multiple insignias upon the ships, the most notable being this Ouroboros kind of symbol with the snake eating its own tail. Not to mention in the story DLC trailer, we do see Marika with this Ouroboros kind of bracelet on her wrist. This is all without mentioning that Messmer is cursed by an abyssal serpent, a base serpent within his eye that Marika knew what to do with. It all seems like a bit too much of a coincidence that those connected to the Shaman and Numen just so happen to have snake shit everywhere. There are also these bird symbols upon the ships. Now maybe I'm stretching, but the ghost flame which originates from the death birds is said to have been extremely similar to Grace. Seems like a bit too much of a coincidence that then these sort of bird-like symbols are then seen on these ships. Not to mention there's a ghost flame dragon next to these ships. Maybe I'm reaching, but considering all of this, I truly believe that these ships were once holding the Numen, and they settled on the Land of Shadows, making a pilgrimage up to the hinterlands. Another massive difference they seem to have with the inhabitants of the Land of Shadows has to be their ability to merge with others. This ability directly tells us how Radhn and Marika fused, how Miquella and Saint Trina fused. It's not the power of an emperyan, it's not the power of a god, not the power of a demigod, it's the power of their bloodline, the power of their family. And the other shaman also possess this ability. A great example from the base game is these ants in the Deeproot Depths. Now they drop these Numen runes, and for a really long time I just thought maybe, hell, these ants devoured these Numen and that's their bodies. But what it actually seems like now is the Numen have fused with these ants, and they are actually the bulb-like protrusion on the back of the ant. Maybe I'm thinking too much into this, but these bulb-like protrusions are white, and from all the depictions of the Numen, they are fair-skinned, hell no, albino-skinned, and have albino hair. These motherfuckers would go to a Halloween party and they would all be called unoriginal because they would all just be pretending to be ghosts. That is how white they are. And I think it's a bit too much of a coincidence that the ants also have these white bulb-like protrusions on their backs. But hell, maybe I'm thinking too much into it. Just before we get on to the third biggest example of this, I just wanted to also talk about the fact that corpse wax gargoyles, they're fused together. Now we know that's an intrinsic property of the shaman, so maybe they take dead warriors of the Numen and they fuse them together, and that is what the gargoyles are. I don't know, just a theory, but it seems quite likely. I lied, there's one more before the last one. If we actually look at Godric, he is technically a shaman. What does he do? Well, he grafts things onto his body. He melds with other beings, just like he does with the dragon. Have you ever thought, oh well, there's no stitching when the dragon attaches? And I think that's because that's his shaman genetics coming into play. I think this is really cool, the fact Miyazaki planned this shit out. Another example of normal Numen and shaman fusing is a lot more sadder. Inside of Shadow of the Erdtree, we actually find out the origin of the jars. Deep within the Land of Shadows, we come across the Bonny Village. And within this Bonny Village, there are dozens, if not hundreds of jars lining the streets. And as we kill more and more enemies, as we kill the soldiers of the Bonny Village, and we talk to spirits, we find out the atrocious actions committed by the Hornsent. We actually find out in this village that the shaman was shoved into these jars and were forced to fuse with each other. They were forced into these jars by the Hornsent. Now the Hornsent, for some reason, believed that these people would grant sainthood to themselves if they all got in these jars and fused together. Now why they believed this, I'm not too sure, but I do have a theory. I believe that because they came from this different world, they're basically aliens to the Land of Shadows. Maybe they saw some sort of divinity in them in their sick and twisted way. Let's just cut them up like Jeffrey Dahmer and stuff them all into these jars, and then they'll become saints. Yippee! Divinity all over. Obviously that didn't happen, and it was just this hideous fusing that eventually led to what I believe new beings being born. That is what I believe is happening when we see these jars, the ones that have been cut open. They're all fused together. But what I find really interesting is these ones haven't fully undergone the process. They're inside the jars, but they haven't got autonomy like the other jars do. Some jars look more like the ones from the Lands Between than others. Some have the arms on them and are walking around. Whereas the fleshy mounds don't actually have this. They're inside the jars, but they're not fully the jars. I think the successful product of the jars is a new being being created of the corpses of other beings. And if this is actually the case, and whatever beings are inside that jar help to create the new being, then the baby jars are even sadder. The baby jars I don't think are going to grow. They stay as baby jars. And to fill a baby jar with corpses, it's going to have to be, well, baby corpses. The shaman village was a village. There was men, women and children. And yet there's no mention of the children anywhere. I believe that is the dark truth of the baby jars. I believe they are actually the children of the shaman village. Now when you consider everything we've just talked about, is it any wonder that Marika would go on to hate anything to do with the Crucible? After all, the people responsible for doing this to her people were of the Crucible. There's two more points I just wanted to make within the jars. First of all, Marika and Messmer definitely cared about them. Deep in the lowest levels of the Shadow Keep, we actually find a hospital wing that's been overrun by these jars. I believe this shows Messmer is trying to help his people, but it failed. Now, on the topic of the jars in the base game, I actually think Marika didn't do this. Now, someone has knowledge of these jars. Someone has to, right? And I think that is exactly what they did. They used this knowledge, because if we actually look where the jars are found, they are giving their essence they've collected to these minor Erdtrees, and yet these minor Erdtrees are protected by Erdtree avatars, which arose after the shattering. I think there might be someone hiding behind the strings, puppeteering this whole jar movement, and they are responsible for the jars in the Lands Between, especially considering they have different lids in the base game. Or maybe these jars in the base game are actually the jars from the Shadow Realm, but their lids have been changed to Erdtree lids once they'd been saved and sent to the lands between. I don't know, I don't think that one's as likely, but it's still a possibility. Item descriptions tell us that she has obviously got this grace, she's returned to her village, only for everyone to have been kidnapped and supposedly put in jars. In her sorrow, she released her grace, and the minor Erdtree we find in the Shaman village is found. We find this incantation of the minor Erdtree. She then offers a piece of her hair to this grandmother statue, which, by the way, I actually don't think is her real grandmother. It's kind of like how at a church certain members are like a sister or father. I think it's kind of the same with grandmother. Maybe it's some kind of elder of the village that she's offering this to, that fused with nature, as that is a part of the shaman. They fuse with things, and as we find, this grandmother, this perhaps elder, is fused with a hinterland tree. Marika's direct actions after being at the hinterland village is unknown. We can't really know, but we do know eventually she made her way to the lands between, where she would start the Golden Order and her Order of the Erdtree, which she found at the darkest point of her life. She would have her son Messmer, who was in fact cursed with the serpent, which, by the way, was perhaps from the Newman's original homeland. In my Messmer video, I pretty much slagged off Marika. I sort of made fun of her and said that she was this horrible parent that was really unkind to Messmer, sending him away. And while I still don't agree with it and think it was the best course of action, there's a lot more to it that I perhaps didn't appreciate enough. A great example being the blessing of Marika, this physic which is blessed by Marika herself. The item description says it was created for Messmer, an attempt to heal him, though she no longer does this. It very much seems to me that Marika loves Messmer, she cares for him, but she tried her very hardest to cure Messmer of his ailments, but she could not succeed, and she failed. And the result of this is the realisation that his curse could destroy her very order. And so she sent Messmer, one of her own, to avenge her own kind. For the crusade in the Land of Shadows was against the Hornsent. The Hornsent were the ones that tortured and brutalised Marika and Messmer's people. So it's only fitting that, with the opportunity, she would send her very own son to deliver the vengeance of the Golden Order. To me, this doesn't seem very evil. It actually makes a lot of sense when you look at it from the traumatised mind of Marika. Hell, even the fact she shuns away all the omens, puts them out of mind, that makes a lot of sense because it would simply be a reminder to the past. It's not good, it's still quite evil, but it makes a lot of sense why she would come to those conclusions and decide to do it. Even the discussion of why Mohg and Morgott were actually forced underground makes a lot more sense. Marika has birthed these omens which share so much resemblance with those that slaughtered and tortured her people. I think it's also worth mentioning that although she did shackle them up, she obviously didn't go very hard on these shackling, for they do seem to just escape, quote unquote, out of nowhere. I think it's really strange that after so much time down there, they just magically appear out of the sewers. I think maybe she felt so much guilt, she let them go. After all, they are still very much shaman. For example, Morgott fuses his blood into a sword. He fuses himself with stone, which is something a shaman would do, and they do with, say, the whip we find inside of Shadow of the Erdtree. And to top this all off, Marika loses her golden child. The child that wasn't afflicted with a curse, that wasn't afflicted with the omen curse, one that was hers solely and shared so much resemblance to her. One child she could really, truly love. And that child was taken away from her by Ranni. The theory's gone around for a really long time now that the death of Godwyn was the catalyst for Marika shattering the Elden Ring. And a lot of people disagreed with that, but looking at this now, after the DLC, I think that theory makes a lot more sense. And I truly believe it personally. In conclusion, I don't think Marika is completely exempt of some of the not nice things she did, but I also think that she is a lot more of a hero than people give her credit, and I do believe she's by far no villain. I really hope you did enjoy this video. If you did, please consider leaving a like and subscribe, as it greatly helps the channel. If you didn't like the video, let me know, as I'm always open to constructive criticism. I'm not going to hold you any longer, so yeah, I really do hope you have a great rest of your day, and may you find your worth in the waking world. Goodbye everyone.